Welcome to those of you who are here. We are gonna probably see a couple more faces join. Really excited to have an opportunity to learn about conservative media ecosystems, which is in a topic that we often have an opportunity to learn about. So was really excited Protagonist was connected to us via Lumina, another PACE member. And their research was really, really fascinating. And we connected early on this year and felt like it was a good time to see if this is something that would be of benefit and value to PACE members at large. So if I haven't met you already, I'm Amy McIsaac. I'm the Managing Director of Learning and Experimentation at PACE. I also help to lead our civic language perceptions project along with Siri, who's on this call as well. So looks like we just lost Shanaz, but I would love to just hear from folks as by way of introduction a little bit about your work and what really brings you to your interest in conservative media ecosystems, help ground a little bit for the context about your work and how it might intersect with this, if at all. You might just be at the beginning of learning, and this is a good place to start. So Michael, let's start with you. Would love to hear more about your work at New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and what brought you to this session today.
Hello, everybody. So I lead the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, which is a statewide community foundation in New Hampshire. I lead our work in education, and that looks a lot like access and opportunity and equity. And we have probably the single most inequitable K-12 school system in the country, just by nature of the fact that we're always 50th out of 50 states in terms of state funding toward public education. The vast burden of our public schools is on the backs of our local property taxpayers. About 72% of all the money raised for education is in local property taxes, and that leads to wild disparities in outcomes for kids across our state. So that's my main interest. Also, in addition to that, access to higher education, policy and advocacy around the education world. And we're seeing over the last 5 years some significant negative inroads from extreme right-wing actors who are looking to build barriers for LGBTQ folks. Anytime there's any mention of diversity, equity, or inclusion work in private businesses or in state agencies, there's a backlash. And we've just been struggling. We just recently had our New Hampshire Supreme Court overturn what was known as the divisive concepts ban, which was a ban modeled after the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. And so for about a 3-year period, our teachers were severely limited in what they could teach around the true history of our country. And so we're seeing lots of the national headlines that are extremely conservative perspectives really taking root here in New Hampshire because we are a small state. It doesn't take a lot to get laws passed in terms of, we're not a state where it takes billions of dollars of investment to get some of these nefarious things passed in our legislature. We're very small. And so we're looking as a foundation to counter some of this with a more positive narrative change campaign and trying to learn as much as I can about the conservative media landscape so that I can make sure that as we build our plan, we're taking that into consideration. And I thank you for your efforts.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Let's go to Christine. Christine, we are just introducing ourselves, our work, and what brought us into coming into a session about conservative media ecosystems. So we'd love to understand some of the context that brings you here today.
Sure, thank you. And I'm off camera because I'm just finishing up some lunch, but really excited to learn. I work at Democracy Fund on our local news ecosystems work. So I'm thinking a lot about local news, a lot about what the media ecosystem looks like in different places. And especially in the past few years, I've been thinking about pink slime and just how sort of the conservative media ecosystem is taking, or I shouldn't say that because I don't know what the term means yet. But what I imagine might be the conservative media ecosystem is sort of taking advantage of a lot of trust that exists in local news and opportunities for just real, genuine relationships among people who live in different communities and want to be able to build power together. So really excited to learn more about what folks have been thinking about. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. I'm actually going to turn to a PACE staff member. We have a couple of those on the call just to also hear, so you can get to know them and also what brings them here today. So let me turn to Siri Erickson.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you all. I am here partly with my civic language perceptions hat on. We've been doing a deep dive, really trying to understand language and how different terms resonate differently with different groups. And in that data, one of the biggest divides that we see in terms of civic language perception is around political identity and party affiliation. So looking to see for crossovers and interconnected themes and insights with the research that we're going to hear about today.
Great. Thanks. Let's go over to Jen.
Hi, everyone. I'm also from the Democracy Fund on Christine's team, the Public Square team. My role is the program strategy and learning. So that's kind of the hat that I'm coming in with, trying to learn about the research and how it'll affect our work.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. Let's go over to Kevin Singer from PACE.
Hey everybody, I'm Kevin. I run communications for PACE. I am a political conservative. I'm very interested in this discussion and what insights come out. I don't pretend to be an expert in political conservatism, but I'm a super curious person, really wanting to learn and not just understand, how to reach folks of conservative persuasion, but also maybe some of the psychology behind conservative outreach and how that shapes audiences and why it's effective sometimes. So I identify as politically conservative, but on this issue I'm just here to learn. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Kevin. Let's go over to, is it Shanaz?
Hi, everyone. I'm Shanaz. I'm at the JPB Foundation. I'm fairly new, about less than a month into my role as a program associate for the Faith Bridging and Belonging team. But overall, the JPB Foundation has been sort of restructuring its priorities and really intent on building or like prioritizing pro-democracy and anti-authoritarian work among our grantees, largely informed by the upcoming election, but even in the future. So yeah, I'm definitely interested in just media at large and, how it propagates and is received by different audiences.
Wonderful. Thanks, Shanaz. Welcome. Joy, let's turn to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joy Osianto. I'm the Managing Director of Funder Engagement here in PACE. And so I'm just really interested in all of the conversations that our members and our member adjacent organizations are having. And it feels like a really important time to be balanced and clear on what's being said on the liberal side, what's being said on the conservative side, so that we're able to create programming and show up to support members regardless of their political leaning.
Thanks, Joy. Tim, welcome. I'm going to turn to you next. We're just introducing ourselves, our organizations, and what brought us to this topic today.
Sounds good. Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. Tim Murphy, he, him pronouns, program officer at McKnight Foundation in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Apologies to be off camera today. This is the only time I could get out to walk my dog, but I'll be listening intently and excitedly. So we work on media and journalism here across the state of Minnesota, and we've also been throwing around the narrative component of what that means for like many, many years now without ever really landing it. And so I think the work of this year and into 2025 is thinking about intersections between narrative, media and journalism and narrative in our program areas. So I'm just here in a learning space to listen and learn. So thank you for creating this conversation pace and I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. Ben, let's turn over to you.
Hey folks, Ben Shaw here. I'm a program officer at the Packard Foundation, the Democracy, Rights, and Governance space. I am personally pretty progressive. However, living in the city of San Francisco, I find I'm a political moderate now. And in my work, I work with a lot of conservatives.
And just moved from Texas. So
Sure
a lot
did.
of interesting angles you bring to this. And we will round it out with the man who introduced us to Protagonist to begin with, Kevin Corcoran from Lumina.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So So I'm at Lumina Foundation. I lead the communications team here. We've been working with Rita and her team at Protagonist for years now to really just better understand people's firmly held beliefs and assumptions about the areas that we work in. As a result of that work, around the time that Donald Trump got elected and then afterwards, we started to notice that there were sets of beliefs that people had that seemed to be heavily influenced by conservative media. So they were sort of like pockets of bubbles, that people were living in. And then as time went by, we recognized that some of those were like jumping into what I call like the mainstream conversation. And there were lots of ways that was happening. But one example would be that Ron DeSantis, when he ran for president, basically was taking frames that had been developed in the conservative media ecosystem and then sort of launching those in the mainstream media. And most reporters don't really have a lot of training around framing research and things like that. So they picked those up uncritically, and so then they started to spread. So that prompted a discussion with Rita a while back where I said, well, you monitor a lot of different narrative landscapes for other clients. Are you seeing the same thing? And she said, yes, and in the other landscapes. And so I said, well, I want to understand better how this works and, sort of what are the strategies and the tactics, and then what does it mean, for us, like how, like I think right now we're in the process of thinking about what, like how do we respond? But what we were seeing was that the narratives that were being introduced were not helpful to the work that we're trying to do. And because they represent firmly held beliefs and assumptions, that, that's kind of a challenge that we have. So I don't want to spoil the surprise, but it was quite interesting to us what Rita and her team found. So hopefully that's a good setup for you. But, this is just part of work that we do to understand how to come into conversations, to shift people's thinking.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate that. Wonderful. Well, that was really helpful grounding for definitely us at PACE, but I know protagonists too, as they think about what questions and reasons that you guys are bringing into the session. We're going to be a pretty, this is about representative of the registration. So we're excited that, sorry for the tech issues. I do not know what was going on with Zoom, having sent you guys confirmations, but then it not getting you in. So glad you guys made your way into the session. And it's going to be pretty conversational because we are kind of small engaged group. So I'll be managing chat. Feel free to pop things in there if helpful, but also feel free to just raise your hand and kind of join the conversation as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Rita, Sydney, and William from Protagonist, who are going to walk us through their research and share some of their findings with us. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Amy and Kevin and everyone. Great to hear actually what brought you into this conversation. I think that helps a lot for thinking about what to emphasize as we go through. So I'm Rita Parhead. I'm the CEO of Protagonist. Really thrilled to be talking to this group and really grateful for Amy for organizing it and for Kevin for sponsoring this work and for being so generous and sharing it with the field. As we said, we'll try to answer questions as we go, so don't hesitate to put things in the chat, and we'll try to address everything as they come in. In a moment, I'll give you a quick intro to Protagonists and what we do in sort of the narrative space. But before I do that, I want to say just a few words about this work. So as Kevin said, we've been working with Lumina Foundation for the past, It's 8 years now, since 2016. Mapping the narratives in higher ed and about higher ed and about economic opportunity and social mobility, really developing an understanding of what the narratives are in media and social media that really shape people's, as Kevin said, people's firmly held beliefs and assumptions. So most of our work with Lumina has been focused in the higher ed space. This work that we're going to look at today is a little different. It's looking at a sort of a wider topical scope. It's looking across all sorts of issue areas and really focusing on a set of specific media outlets, 38 media outlets to be specific, that William will walk you through in a moment, that make up what we are calling the conservative media ecosystem. And the reason, as Kevin alluded to, that we want to do this is over the years of looking at the higher ed landscape, but also at other landscapes we look at, whether it be climate change or abortion rights or K through 12 education or the social safety net or criminal justice reform, all sorts of issue landscapes, we've seen sort of this, the increasing strength and power of conservative narratives, of narratives coming from conservative outlets. And they have become increasingly, in many cases, anti-democratic and a threat to a future of the future of multiracial, inclusive, just democracy. So that has been, I think anybody who pays attention to conservative media has probably seen this march. And we wanted to understand with more rigor and in a more systematic way what these outlets are doing, what sort of narratives they're pushing out, how they're doing it, why they're so effective, what we can learn from that, in order to understand, how this is shaping our broader information environment. So with that, we'll take a look at, maybe we can go to the next slide. I'll give you just a quick overview of what we at Protagonist do in general, and what our sort of understanding of narratives are, because that's sort of the cornerstone of this analysis. So narratives is one of those terms that I think a few of you mentioned it already in your remarks. It's been sort of increasingly common to see people talk about narratives and the importance of narratives. I'm sure everybody on this call knows what they are, but this is really just a way of grounding what we mean when we say that term. And when we're talking about narratives, we're talking about shared stories that act as filters or sort of mental models through which people consume and process information. So one important aspect of that is that they're shared stories. A narrative is not something that I just carry around in my head, my interpretation of the world. It really is something that exists in sort of a social space. And they are crucially, for any given issue, there's not just a single narrative. There's not a narrative about higher ed or a narrative about climate change. There are always multiple narratives in play, and those public narratives are what shape the sort of public conversation, and they make up what we call the narrative landscape. So what we have here is an example just from one particular issue area that we've looked at, which is the criminal justice system. And just to give you a flavor of the sort of things we mean by narratives, now I'm not going to go through these one by one, but the idea is that, and this is only a handful of the narratives that exist in this landscape, but different narratives will have different assumptions. They will center different heroes and villains and victims. They will operate under different logic. They will have maybe different claims on the truth. And the point is, in identifying the different narratives, is not to say that these are right and these are wrong, or these are true and these are false, but to say these are sort of out there. They exist. They shape what people believe. They shape how people interact in the world. And if you are an organization that is trying to navigate these conversations or achieve your own strategic objectives, you need to be aware of what they are and understand how they operate and what you can do in that environment. If we go to the next slide, the other important thing to know about narratives is that they are shaped by key actors, and particularly what we're going to look at here are media outlets, but there are different sort of narrative actors out there. There are media outlets which are really, really powerful narrative actors. Policymakers is another thing we look at sometimes in some of our work, social media users and influencers, and they all tap into narrative power in different ways. And they are the ones that are sort of shaping, defining the bounds of, and moving the landscape. If we go to the next slide, this is at the highest level what our narrative analytics process is. This is our analytic methodology. William will talk in a little more detail about what we did in this particular research, which will be more specific to the conservative media ecosystem. But just to give you a sense of kind of where our expertise lies, we start from the perspective of there are narratives out there on a given issue, and they sort of exist in a written digital form. So we build custom data sets, typically traditional media and or social media data sets that have, depending on the issue we're looking at, we have global coverage. And then using natural language processing, we can identify clusters of narratives of like-sounding language, of like-sounding ideas and concepts. And then our analysts go in, read sort of samples of that material and identify what those narratives are. They developed specialized machine learning models to then sort of find and classify huge data sets using those models, so we can identify that these tens of thousands of lines of content are articulating this narrative, and these over here are doing this. We do this in order to answer questions that are the organizations we work with, which are primarily in the foundation space, around how to engage different audiences, how to message and develop communication strategy, how to measure the impact of their work, how to engage with different stakeholders. And we build different kinds of analytic products that allow us to do that. So if we go to the next slide, I'll give you just a quick overview of the agenda for the rest of the presentation, just to give you a sense of what's coming. In the first piece of it, we'll do an overview and context that's really intended to introduce you to the data set that we're looking at here. I mentioned there are 38 media outlets, conservative media outlets that kind of compose our data set. And we looked at them over several years and looked at all the content they produced. Then we'll turn to sort of our single biggest finding in this research, which is that there are a small set, in fact, 4 strategic narratives that animate the vast majority of the content coming out of these conservative media outlets. So it was a very striking finding, and we'll walk you through what those narratives are, what those strategic narratives are, and tell you a little bit about how different outlets sort of array against these narratives. And then we'll turn to something we're calling the Pages from the Conservative Media Playbook. And this is looking at a set of tactics we've identified that conservative media outlets use in sort of pushing out these narratives. Now, when we developed this, we currently have 10 tactics we've identified, and that's not an exhaustive list. There are definitely more out there, but we've looked at 10 specifically. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to highlight 3 of those. And we can always talk about more if people are interested. But it's meant to have a sense of how these outlets are doing what they're doing, and in many ways, how they're so effective in doing what they're doing. So with that, I will turn it over to William to begin to kind of dig into what we've found in the conservative media research. Before we do that, if anybody has any questions about kind of where we're going with this and wants to put them in the chat, I don't know if we have any yet, please feel free to do so, and we'll keep an eye on those. So over to you, William.
Awesome, thank you. So I want to start out here with a brief overview of the data set and a look at a high level of what that data consists of. So to start with the definition, in this presentation, when we say the conservative media ecosystem, precisely what we mean are the 38 outlets arrayed on screen here, which really are the leading conservative outlets that operate at a national level. They're name brand outlets here, Fox News, Breitbart, as well as many more outlets that operate more out of the spotlight, but are certainly intertwined in this ecosystem. What we've done then is pull every article, regardless of topic, published by all of these 38 outlets since January of 2020, which amounts to a full data set of 2.2 million media articles that we're working with here, which really is an amazing sandbox of data with which to work to answer questions. What we then do with this data is probe in a variety of human and machine-led techniques to determine the primary narrative logic used in each of those 2.2 million articles, which allows us to answer questions of narratives, for instance, which are used most often, how is that shifted, what language is used most, as well as answer questions about media outlets as narrative actors and as shapers of narratives within this ecosystem. I can also walk through here a look at the topics focused on in this data set. So I'm going to press play on a video here and let it roll in the background while I speak. So this is a racing bar chart that shows the portion of articles over time that focus on a variety of topics. You can watch topics grow and shrink here. So for instance, you saw COVID zoom out to be the dominant topic by a margin over the course of much of 2022. As we approach the November election here, you'll see elections, politics growing as topics of focus. Democracy came up there briefly as a topic of focus. However, it has generally hovered around 3 to 7% of articles using the language of democracy or elections or voting over time. This report we'll talk about today generally is topic agnostic, but we'd say the learnings of this ecosystem can be applied to pretty much all of the topics in this cascade. I'm going to pause this for the sake of the time. This is a fun video, one to come back to for sure, but I want to pass over to Sydney now to introduce the concept of strategic narrative.
Thanks, William. So yeah, I think sort of the moment we've all been waiting for here, we'll start by talking about the strategic narratives themselves. And before I even show you the 4 strategic narratives employed by the conservative media ecosystem, I want to start quickly by defining what we actually mean when we use the term strategic narrative. So as Rita mentioned earlier, we think of narratives as structured stories that animate a public conversation about any given issue. So there may be narratives about higher education, about abortion, about immigration. What makes strategic narratives different is that they're the topic agnostic blueprints that supply the framing and logic for a variety of narratives across a variety of social issues. So we see their fingerprints across a number of different landscapes. And we use the word strategic for a reason. These strategic narratives are purposely designed to tell intentional stories about how the world operates, where power is held, and where the readers should see threats in the world around them. And as we've said, the conservative media ecosystem and outlets within that ecosystem are particularly adept at employing 4 strategic narratives of this sort. So we'll turn to the next slide where I won't spend a ton of time here because I'm about to walk through each of these strategic narratives in detail, but here you can see those 4 arrayed. And as you start to scan this slide, you'll notice that they all may look pretty familiar to you. And that's because they are the building blocks from which most conservative media and messaging is built. And so you've heard these stories before in different channels and mediums, and especially now in an election year, these all will probably seem familiar. But in their own way, they all tell some story about American decline in the hands of the Democrats. So in these narratives, you'll hear stories about the need to take back power and to right the ship towards conservative values and ideals. And you'll also hear, as I describe these narratives, that they often reinforce racial stereotypes and racist dynamics in different ways. But you also find that each of these are distinct in their strategic intent and in the role that they play in this broader ecosystem. So let's begin with Reject the Woke Agenda. This strategic narrative tells a story about the threats against conservative social values. It argues that there is a war in America over our cultural identity, and that leftist indoctrination, wokeness, and social justice warriors are winning, and you can see them everywhere you turn. And in equating conservative values such as traditional family units, religious faith, and patriotism to American principles, it effectively argues that defending conservative values is a defense of America itself. As such, this narrative often centers Christianity, whiteness, and patriarchy by implicitly framing these as both the default and the superior values that we must defend against this leftist threat. And you can all probably in your heads very easily fill in how this strategic narrative sounds across different topic areas. And as Rita mentioned, at Protagonist, we monitor a variety of social issue landscapes, and this is a strategic narrative whose fingerprints we see perhaps most clearly across the board, especially in recent years, from narratives about higher education and K-12 education to abortion, health equity, environmental justice, and more. And that's because ultimately this strategic narrative finds its energy in attacking progressive social movements, and especially those related to race and gender. And so this emphasis on the threat to power and control appeals to the idea that you are losing your power in society. And if you want to maintain that privilege, we need to change course, take power from the left, and return to traditional conservative values. Now, while Reject the Woke Agenda is all about threats to social values, Americans Under Siege tells a story about physical threats and paints a picture of increased lawlessness in America. It presents the idea that there are waves of criminality and illegal immigration which work in concert to create a real loss of safety. And because of this, you, reader, should be afraid. This strategic narrative relies on the idea that most people are inherently bad, and only with strict enforcement of laws and a firm hand can we keep those people in line. So there's a clear solution, which one in this group we might notice has the potential to lean quite authoritarian. Clamp down with police, increase border security, fund the American military, and defend the Second Amendment such that we arm the good guys to fight against the bad. And again, we see the strategic narrative arguing that conservatives must restore order and take back power from democratic policymakers, as well as from these quote unquote bad guys, who, as you might imagine, are often either steeped in racially coded language or more explicitly just men of color, especially Black men and Latin American immigrants. So ultimately, the thrust of this narrative is about stoking fear at both an individual and collective level, and importantly, has the potential to imply that a physical, even violent reaction is warranted in response to such threats. The third strategic narrative, Preserve Capitalism, argues that there is no question that free market capitalism works. And we know this because it has propelled the American economy to be the strongest in the history of the world. It argues that our capitalist system is a meritocracy, and as such that we should be rewarding those who work hard within the system. Those that fall behind, it argues, are slackers and unworthy of such support. This strategic narrative, therefore, has very clear connections to content about the economy and the social safety net, but it's also rife with arguments against racial equity initiatives, arguing that programs like affirmative action or sometimes even the concept of racial inequality is a way to stack the deck against these hard workers and towards these grifters. In this way, this narrative too plays on classic racial stereotypes, often about the worthiness of white capitalists to consolidate their wealth, and that it's the laziness of Black and Brown Americans that keeps them back. So this is a sort of classic conservative logic used to reinforce the idea that our current system, which it idealizes as perfectly fair, is the only path to collective economic prosperity and meritocracy, and that as an individual within it, we must accept that this is the system we have, lace up our bootstraps, and work to achieve the American dream. Now, the fourth and final strategic narrative, Expose the Deception, has a slightly different quality to it, and it argues that everything going on in America these days just doesn't quite add up, and we can't trust those in power to tell us the real truth. So it poses questions like, why were the lockdowns so long? Or why do you get shut down if you even ask about election fraud? Questions designed to make the reader doubt their trust in institutions and experts and to build a culture of conspiracy. Because there is so much deception, the solution posed by this strategic narrative is that the conservative media ecosystem, and really also the readers themselves, need to do the work of exposing the real truth. Powers must be taken out of the hands of sketchy shadow elites, the deep state, big tech, multinational corporations, and put back in the hands of the people. And of course, despite mainstream media being on this list of untrustworthy institutions, the conservative media ecosystem is exempt from the same scrutiny because they're the ones asking these questions. So while these four strategic narratives take up distinct angles on conservatism and the state of America, they really reinforce one another as well. And you can think of these as interlocking narratives that together make up the vast majority of content being espoused by these 38 outlets in the conservative media ecosystem. So I'll turn it over to William to walk us through that data, unless we have any questions to interject with first.
Yes, absolutely. So given that these four strategic narratives dominate, or I want to speak to how these four strategic narratives dominate media coverage, and given how many things there are to write media articles about and how many strategic narrative frames could hypothetically be used, it is striking just how often these outlets turn to these four strategic narratives. So this chart shows for each of those 38 outlets, the portion of articles that they publish that use the logic of one of these four strategic narratives. We can see that all but one outlet use strategic narratives in over half of articles that they publish, and the majority do so in over 3/4 of articles that they publish, which illustrates that striking takeaway that these outlets have overwhelmingly cohered behind the strategic narratives. The gray portion of this bar represents content that does not explicitly align with the strategic narratives, notably some of the larger outlets that do more straight news reporting or reporting on sports and pop culture have a larger gray bar, but even those outlets are significant purveyors of the strategic narratives, and by absolute volume are really some of the leading users of these strategic narratives. Can break into one level deeper of depth here by bringing in and separating out those strategic narratives. So this we tend to call a narrative cascade, which shows by year the distribution of all articles published across these 4 strategic narratives, as well as the 3 other categories of content that we're tracking. So this can be read, for example, 30% of articles published in 2023 employed the logic of reject the woke agenda. First note here is that these strategic narratives are not new. All 4 have been prominent for at least 4 years, and we imagine well before then as well. Reject the woke agenda has been used most often through this entire time period and has grown in relative volume. Let's have shifted their focus increasingly towards, quote, social culture wars issues. Americans Under Siege, consistently the second most used, and used on a drumbeat to highlight examples of crime, of disarray at the border, of other general topics of unsafety. Notably, Expose the Deception nearly matches Americans Under Siege in overall volume, which illustrates just how deeply conspiratorial ideas have embedded themselves within this ecosystem. And then finally, Preserve Capitalism, the most traditional conservative narrative of these 4, falls by volume well below the others. And then finally, want to introduce the idea that in this research, we can look at an outlet level, not just as an ecosystem level. This is a first slide of a larger section that we're not going to walk through today, but one point to tee up here to illustrate the point or underscore the point of the previous 2 slides is that all 38 of these outlets engage and use all 4 of the strategic narratives and do so at relatively sizable volume. That's Annie. I'm going to pass back over to you.
Thanks, William. So in this last section, we'll talk about the techniques that the conservative media ecosystem actually uses to promulgate these strategic narratives. And this is useful both as a way to learn from the behavior of this ecosystem and to think at a sort of tactical counter-messaging level, but also because we'll highlight not just the tactics being used, but also the strategic objective being pursued by each of these tactics and what that may tell us. So I'll start by taking just a moment on this next slide and let you all scan the list of tactics we've identified. This is certainly a non-exhaustive list of all of the tactics that exist, but for each of these 10, we've built out a series of slides to show how these techniques are being used by outlets. And so, as Rita mentioned, if any of you are particularly interested in 1 or 2 of these, feel free to let us know. But today we'll be walking through 3 tactics in particular: lay claim to American identity, weaponize and invert racial dynamics, and manufacture villains. And we'll start by defining each tactic and its objectives, and then William will walk through an example of the successful implementation of the tactic and what it might mean. So we'll start with lay claim to American identity. And this tactic really aims to cement the bond between these classic American ideas such as free speech, equal opportunity, and love of country, and make them synonymous with conservative values. And with these associations built by transitive logic, any attack on conservatives can be reframed as an attack on American ideals. This helps conservative outlets then be the voice of authority on what is or is not, quote unquote, American. And we've seen this happen with the concepts of freedom and fairness, their use of the American flag, etc. But William will talk about how these outlets use patriotism as a real exemplary use of this tactic.
Thank you. Yes, so want to take a look at this tactic to claim American identity using a precise example here for how these outlets employ the language of patriotism, which I know is language that PACE has generated a lot of knowledge about. So this language has been used on a drumbeat by these outlets. This chart shows the portion of articles over time that use the word. Used incredibly often, notably never more so than directly following January 6th, as these outlets work to paint insurrectionists as patriots in this period and redraw the lines and redraw the narrative of what is and is not American, really working to valorize the bravery that it took to stand up to an effort to steal the election. And this tactic and this language is decidedly not a feature of any one corner of the ecosystem. Every outlet is employing this tactic to lay claim to American identity, as measured here by a look at the portion of articles by outlet that use the patriotism language, which is certainly present in all outlets and above 2% of articles for several. Send you back over to you for the next tactic.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think this discussion of patriotism raises a question of what conservative outlets mean by American identity. And as you might imagine, directly or indirectly, it often means white American identity. So as we turn to the weaponize and invert racial dynamics tactic, this tactic certainly does not capture everything that relates to race or feeds racist perspectives, but rather it's focused on the practice of leveraging real racial dynamics and then turning those dynamics on their head. So when whiteness or white dominant culture is challenged, the conservative media ecosystem will routinely make accusations of anti-white discrimination. And this practice of undermining challenges to white dominant culture creates space to be really angry at people who are framed by outlets as anti-white. And also, importantly, to frame the existing social order as naturally occurring rather than the product of historic centralization of power in white communities. So I'll send it back to you, William, to talk about the reflex to cry racist when the concept of whiteness is raised.
Yes, so have a slide here to bring forward an example of how these conservative outlets have treated the language of whiteness as a window through which to explore this tactic to weaponize and invert racial dynamics. So in the summer of 2020, Fox News broke a story about a page at the National Museum of African American History that defines and explores, quote, whiteness and how our, quote, white dominant culture operates. Outside the conservative ecosystem, I think we would imagine this likely would not organically have created its own news cycle. But in the following weeks, 23 of the 38 outlets wrote their own article about this page, all with the focus on the despicableness of talking about white dominant culture. That's that first spike you see here. But these outlets are not ones to let a compelling anecdote go to waste. In the intervening 3 years, this page about white dominant culture has been repeatedly elevated. That's all these new little spikes that you see in this chart to buttress the case whenever the opportunity arises that focusing on, quote, whiteness or whiteness as a concept is itself a racist act.
So for our third and final tactic that we'll talk about today, I think this is another place where we often see that repeated laser focus on a single issue, and in this case on the creation of villains. So this tactic really capitalizes on when a person or organization acts in violation of conservative values, and once a compelling villain has been established, they can then be slotted in as scapegoats again and again and again when a new issue arises. So this is leveraged as a storytelling technique, but also is essential in creating an us versus them mindset, We've seen this happen with people like Nicole Hannah-Jones or Ibram X. Kendi, and also places like Portland, Oregon, or San Francisco. So I'll send it back to William for the last time to talk about how this has played out with BlackRock, of all organizations, being painted as a villain.
Yes, so wanted to tee up a final example here of BlackRock, the multinational investment corporation, as an operative villain for outlets in this ecosystem. So BlackRock, maybe somewhat of an unexpected villain, but has proven effective in the anti-woke, anti-elite messaging push of these outlets, which paint BlackRock as a puppet master or a power broker pulling the strings of the American economy. This chart shows a temporal of the portion of articles over time in this ecosystem that mention BlackRock. To an extent, it's been mentioned through this entire time period, but really took off in its focus and took off as a villain at the beginning of 2022 around their defense of ESG investing as a practice. BlackRock, definitely not a one-dimensional villain within this landscape. Once they were established at this point as a target villain for these outlets, they've been slotted in again and again as new issues arise. So BlackRock is also described as a villain in mandating woke ideology in their ESG scores. So they're blamed for Target selling Pride Gear. BlackRock is blamed for Bud Light going woke in their advertising. Also, given some connections to the Biden administration, conservative outlets consistently describe BlackRock as a forward operative working for the Chinese Communist Party to weaken US national security. BlackRock is described as having a huge coordinated effort to buy off US senators to achieve their own goals. BlackRock is described as solely responsible for manipulating the US housing market and spiking prices for the people of the United States. So all to say that list goes on in relation to BlackRock, but they really have been consistently elevated to support this us versus them messaging structure and underscore points attempted to be made by these outlets. With that, I'm going to pass Rita back over to you to zoom us out on this research.
Great, thank you. So that was like pretty fast through a lot of material. If we have it summarized on the next slide, just to give you sort of a picture of what we just went through, which is we talked about sort of what's coming out of these outlets, and we characterized them and classified them along these 4 major strategic narratives. We identified which outlets are doing what, and we just gave you that one view to give you a sense of outlet by outlet where their emphasis lies. And then we spotlighted 3 of the 10 tactics that we've identified in this ecosystem. So all of this, when we sort of look at this entire system and look at it with this kind of analytic eye, what we see is a system that is in service of very much in service of advancing a political project, the conservative political project. And it sort of raises the question of what do organizations that are interested in strengthening democracy, and in particular strengthening just, inclusive, multiracial democracy, what do you do in this environment? Are there things that we can learn about what's done well in terms of messaging and message discipline and coordination? And are there things we just need to be aware of in terms of where we can support efforts to counter or neutralize or reframe or build on an understanding of an audience? So this is intended to kind of give a window into that piece, a very powerful piece of the larger information environment. We have been talking about doing a similar look at other outlets. So looking at, if you want to call it the progressive ecosystem or the liberal ecosystem, depending on how you define the specific outlets. I think there's an interest in doing that work. I think there's also interest in looking more broadly at what we think of as sort of mainstream outlets and what role they play in between maybe these more ideologically committed outlets, and what role they play in amplifying and furthering the reach of some of the narratives that might originate on the extremes. So this is all work that's sort of ahead for us that we're looking to do, and we're partly trying to get a temperature of those in philanthropy about where there is interest in doing more, learning more, and connecting it to the larger democracy supporting agenda. So I'll maybe open it up to see if there are questions, comments. Amy, I don't know if you have sort of thoughts on building on what we heard from the group earlier on too.
Yeah, let's just open it up, see what folks have. We have about 7 minutes for at the top of the hour. Would love if there's any kind of things on people's minds burning that want to ask while we still have time.
Hi, apologies. I'm straight off. I'm walking outside as well right now. For my foundation at the Packard Foundation, we are interested in contesting conservatives in the sense that as our theory of change is that as we are promoting a democracy country, we want to make sure that we can get even conservatives to also be for democracy. So using the strategies that you have here, how do we delve into the same values that are within these messaging, but be able to pull folks in order to continue to support democracy? What can you give us examples of how that's being done and that's being done well?
Yeah, I think if I heard the question right, and please tell me if I missed something, you were cutting in and out a little bit there, but looking at from the Packard perspective of in contesting conservative values, what have we learned about the way this is done that might be opportunities for efforts to counter that? Is that sort of the question?
Exactly. Because I think from a lot of the narrative framing here, I think it comes from quite a bit of negative framing right now for all four of them that we highlighted. Are there ways that we can appeal to conservative values in a positive way, in a pro-democracy manner that can still contest conservatives and not just concede all of the voters?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think from our perspective, one of the things we really think is important to do in advance of figuring out how to reach, say, audiences that are drawn to this is to understand sort of where the strengths are of other outlets. So this is really looking at a somewhat closed ecosystem where there's a lot of reinforcement of messages by small and large outlets, and but to understand what that larger information environment looks like. So in understanding the role that so-called maybe progressive outlets play, mainstream outlets play, and how they maybe where their strengths already lie. Our sense is, having not yet done this research, is that the conservative outlets are the ones that are most disciplined, most effective. I don't know that we're going to find simply 4 strategic narratives in other ecosystems. However, I think in understanding what that larger map looks like, I think we can see where the potential to erode some of the strength here, appeal to some of the same values, maybe not allow the laying claim to American identity to go unanswered, those sorts of things, and to see what's effective, right? So some of this is actually just, there's some empirical questions that we can investigate to see if there are opportunities, areas of strength, areas of potential collaboration that can be had. So that's something I think that from our perspective, there's kind of a set of empirical analysis we'd like to do to help inform those, identifying those opportunities. I think there's also a question that even just looking tactic by tactic, when are there opportunities to take something like the articulation of patriotism and try to, claw back some of the language and use it? Or when is that sort of, the language is not that important, that particular language, that word is not so important as the larger narrative that it's tapping into. And so I think the thing that this reveals is that this is not just a language game for conservative outlets. They are really effective at using language, but there's a sort of an iceberg underneath that language, which are these strategic narratives. And I think all the great work that PACE has done to understand empirically where how language resonates with different language resonates when it comes to civic concepts, I think informs how we think about what some of those openings might be. But I think what this is saying is there's kind of a larger strategic context to figure out. So if the goal is to counter, say, reject the woke agenda specifically, there might be a particularly concerted effort you want to make around some of the things that are particularly good at promoting that narrative, which might be different from efforts to counter, say, Americans under siege. So that this gives a little bit of a more precise map of what all this these outlets are doing and how they're accomplishing it and what they are doing at different points in time, to maybe help give that a little finer resolution on the response. One thing we're very interested in is seeing between now and the election, because that's elections are always crucibles for this kind of stuff, how these narratives play and which ones which messages end up being the tip of the spear, for especially now that the election landscape has changed in the last 24, 48 hours.
We have time for about one more question if someone has something they want to get in here.
I'll speak for a second, Kevin, to the question in the chat before maybe a final question. This is sort of a part of answering this question. I think something we think about a lot is how outlets outside of the conservative media ecosystem treat similar sorts of articles. So if there is an idea put forward primarily in the conservative media ecosystem, is it completely ignored by mainstream media? Is it covered as a conspiratorial idea? Is it covered as news? Is it lifted up in much the same way in mainstream outlets, et cetera? That sort of answering a question with a question, but I'm really curious about how those paths work and what outlets outside of the conservative media ecosystem are carrying water for different ideas or different media outlets, et cetera.
It's a good question, and yeah, thanks, William, for that. It's such an interesting tipping point that I hadn't really pondered enough. It's like, when does it become that versus this? So something I think really to think about. I have like 17 more questions that I've been holding back, and we are just at time. So this is maybe the fastest hour I've had in a very long time. I'm really grateful to the Protagonist team for sharing your research. Thankful for Lumina for partnering with Protagonist to do the research and to get it done and to share what you learned with us. I feel like it's just the beginning of our understanding about what that iceberg is underneath these words. And we've been in Civic Language Project talking a lot about words as signals, like they're these like little they're signals that sometimes go sideways, but they're definitely the beginning of a whole other universe. And I feel like you're starting to help us see that universe more clearly from at least one perspective. So thank you for your work. I'll send out an email in the next couple of days with either the slides, the recording, or both, so that people have something to refer back to if this information would be helpful to your colleagues. And then shoot us a note if you have any thoughts or questions. Or particularly, I know Protagonist is thinking a lot about where is there other energy in the philanthropic field for research like this moving forward. So do drop us a line and let us know if you have thoughts on that. And thank you so much for spending an hour with us. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.